Welcome back to another gentle journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where love wasn't always meant to last forever, where marriages came with expiration dates, and where the very notion of until death do us part was, well, negotiable. Before we settle in together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And I'm curious, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to discover who's joining us in these quiet explorations of the past. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let yourself drift back to a time when marriage was often less about romance and more about practicality. Tonight, we'll explore the peculiar world of trial marriages, temporary unions, and experimental partnerships that challenged everything we think we know about commitment. Picture, if you will, a world where couples could test their compatibility for a year and a day before deciding whether to make it permanent. Imagine societies where religious law actually sanctioned short-term marriages, complete with contracts and conditions. These weren't failed relationships, they were intentional, culturally accepted arrangements that served purposes we've largely forgotten. From the misty highlands of medieval Scotland to the bustling bazaars of Safavid Iran, from the grand temples of Tenochtitlan to the quiet monasteries of colonial Peru, we'll uncover stories of unions that were meant to be temporary, relationships that existed in the spaces between tradition and innovation. So let yourself sink deeper into comfort as we begin this exploration. The past, as always, is stranger and more human than we might expect. Verse 1. A handfasted wife of medieval Scotland. The morning mist clings to the heather as Margaret pulls her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. It's been 11 months and 3 days since she stood before the blacksmith's anvil with Duncan, their hands bound together with strips of linen while the village watched. 11 months and 3 days of a marriage that may not be a marriage at all, depending on what they decide when the year and a day are complete. This is handfasting, Scotland's ancient tradition of trial marriage, where couples could live as husband and wife for exactly 1 year and 1 day before choosing whether to formalize their union in the eyes of the church. Margaret's calloused hands work the morning dough as she contemplates this peculiar arrangement that has governed her life for nearly a full cycle of seasons. The custom stretches back into the mists of Celtic tradition, long before Christianity took firm root in the Scottish Highlands. In a harsh landscape where survival often depended on the strength of partnerships, handfasting served as a practical test. Could this man provide? Could this woman manage a household? Could they work together through the long, dark winters when the world seemed to shrink to the size of a single hearth? Margaret's cottage sits at the edge of the village, close enough to hear the morning calls of her neighbors, but far enough to feel the weight of her uncertain status. She is married, but not quite. She is a wife, but temporarily. The other women in the village treat her with a mixture of acceptance and reserve. After all, she might not be here next month if she and Duncan decide the arrangement hasn't worked. The handfasting ceremony itself had been simple. No priest, no church, no elaborate feast. Just the two of them, the blacksmith to witness, and the ancient words spoken over the anvil, a symbol of strength and permanence. Ironically enough, for a union that was anything but permanent. The iron grows cold, the old women said, but the heart decides its own temperature. Duncan works the fields that border 3 different properties, a man caught between lairds and allegiances. His proposal of handfasting had been practical rather than romantic. "We'll see how we suit," he'd said, his rough hands already reaching for hers. A year and a day to learn each other's ways. Now, as autumn approaches and the year grows short, Margaret finds herself cataloging the rhythms of their shared life. Duncan rises before dawn and returns after sunset, his boots heavy on the threshold. He's gentle with the animals, patient with broken tools, and he's never once raised his voice to her. But there's a distance between them, a careful politeness that speaks of two people still deciding whether they want to bridge the gap between necessity and affection. The neighbors watch, of course. In a village where everyone knows everyone else's business, the approaching end of a hand-fasting period creates a particular kind of tension. Will they stay? Will they part? Will Margaret pack her few belongings and return to her sister's house? Or will she and Duncan walk to the kirk and speak different vows, these ones binding until death? Margaret kneads the dough with steady, practiced motions, her mind turning over the year like fingers working through wool. There have been moments of genuine companionship evenings by the fire when Duncan would tell stories of his travels to other villages, mornings when they worked in the garden together, their hands occasionally brushing as they tended the herbs. But there have also been long silences, meals eaten without conversation, nights when they lay side by side, like strangers sharing a bed out of convenience rather than choice. The beauty of hand fasting, the old women said, was that it acknowledged what everyone knew but rarely spoke, that marriage was hard work, and not everyone was suited for it. Better to discover incompatibility after a year than after a lifetime. Better to part as friends than to remain as enemies bound by sacred vows. Margaret's mother had been hand-fasted twice before settling into the marriage that produced Margaret herself. The first trial had ended amicably. The man was kind but weak, unsuited for the harsh realities of Highland life. The second had been more difficult. He was strong but cruel, and Margaret's mother had counted the days until she could escape. The third, Margaret's father, had been neither the strongest nor the kindest, but he had been steady, reliable, and genuinely fond of her mother's sharp wit. Marriage, her mother had told her, is like choosing a horse. You don't buy one without riding it first. Now, as Margaret shapes the loaves that will feed her household for the coming days, she wonders what her mother would think of Duncan. He's not cruel, certainly. He's not weak, but is he enough? Is this quiet, careful partnership enough to build a life on? The question hangs in the air, like the smoke from the hearth, neither urgent nor ignorable. In 3 weeks, the year and a day will be complete. In 3 weeks, Margaret will have to decide whether this trial marriage becomes a permanent one, or whether she untie the metaphorical knots that have bound her to this man and this life. She thinks of her sister, married properly in the church with all the ceremony and celebration such unions require. Her sister seems happy enough, though Margaret has noticed how her brother-in-law's eyes sometimes linger on other women in the village, how her sister's laughter has grown more forced over the years. Permanent doesn't always mean better, Margaret reflects. Sometimes it just means you're stuck with your choice, whether it was wise or not. The morning sun climbs higher, burning away the mist that cloaked the hills. Margaret slides the loaves into the oven and wipes her hands on her apron. Duncan will be home for the midday meal, and perhaps today she'll ask him what he's thinking about their approaching decision. Perhaps today they'll finally speak of the future that hovers just beyond the edges of their careful present. Or perhaps they'll eat in the companionable silence that has marked so many of their meals, each lost in private thoughts about whether this strange, practical arrangement they've called marriage is worth making permanent. The fire crackles in the hearth, the bread bakes slowly in the oven, and Margaret continues her daily work, suspended between one life and another, between a choice made and a choice yet to be made. The year and a day stretch around her like a season that's neither fully autumn nor quite winter, a time of waiting and watching, and wondering whether love can grow from the careful soil of practical compatibility. In the distance, the church bells mark the hours, each chime a reminder that time moves forward, whether we're ready or not. Margaret listens to their measured cadence and finds a strange comfort in their reliability. Unlike marriages both trial and permanent, the bells will ring tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, measuring out the moments of human uncertainty with their ancient, unwavering rhythm. Verse 2. The merchant's temporary wife in Safavid Iran. The call to prayer drifts across the courtyard as Zahra adjusts her chatter and counts the silver coins that will serve as her dower, for the next 3 months. In the bustling commercial heart of Isfahan, where merchants from across the known world converge to trade silk and spices, she is about to enter into a mut'ah marriage, a temporary union sanctioned by Shia Islamic law and as carefully negotiated as any business contract. Her husband-to-be, Mirza Hassan, is a textile merchant from Kashan who travels to Isfahan 4 times a year. He's a small man with intelligent eyes and hands stained purple from handling the finest dyes. This will be his second mut'ah marriage in Isfahan. The first was with a widow who kept a tea house near the Grand Bazaar. That arrangement lasted 6 months and ended amicably when her permanent husband returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca. The practice of mut'ah, literally pleasure or enjoyment, traces its origins to the earliest days of Islam, when the Prophet's companions would enter into temporary marriages during long military campaigns. In Safavid Iran, under the Twelver Shia interpretation of Islamic law, these unions have evolved into something far more complex, a social institution that serves the needs of merchants, pilgrims, students, and women in circumstances that permanent marriage cannot address. Zara's own situation is delicate. She is 26, a widow with no children, living in her deceased husband's house under the watchful eyes of his family. Her brother-in-law has been making increasingly obvious suggestions about her future, none of them appealing. The mut'ah marriage offers her a temporary escape, a chance to live independently while maintaining her reputation and, importantly, her right to her late husband's property. The negotiations took place over several days, mediated by a mullah who specializes in such arrangements. The contract specifies everything: the duration, the mahr, the living arrangements, and the expectations of both parties. Unlike permanent marriage, mut'ah requires no witnesses beyond the religious authority, no elaborate ceremonies, no family celebrations. It is, the critics say, marriage stripped of its social bonds and reduced to its most basic elements. But Zara finds a different kind of honesty in this arrangement. There will be no false promises of eternal love, no pretense that this union serves any purpose beyond mutual convenience and companionship. Mirza Hassan needs a wife during his months in Isfahan, someone to manage his temporary household, to provide the comfort and stability that a man requires when conducting business in a foreign city. Zara needs the protection and income that come with being a married woman, even temporarily. The morning of the nikah, the Islamic marriage ceremony arrives, with the scent of jasmine and the sound of water trickling through the courtyard fountain. The mullah, a round-faced man with kind eyes, speaks the necessary words in Arabic, while Zara and Mirza Hassan sit on opposite sides of a silk carpet. The ceremony takes less time than brewing tea, but it is no less binding for its brevity. I marry you to myself for the agreed period and the agreed mahr, Mirza Hassan recites, his voice steady but not entirely confident. I accept, Zara responds, her words carrying the weight of 3 months of uncertainty and possibility. And just like that, they are husband and wife until the autumn rains arrive. The arrangement proves more complex than either anticipated. Mirza Hassan is a methodical man who rises before dawn to pray and spends his days in the covered bazaars, negotiating with Armenian silk merchants and Jewish dyers. He returns home in the evening tired, but rarely irritable, content to eat the meals Zara prepares and to discuss the day's business with someone who understands the intricacies of trade. Zara discovers that temporary marriage creates its own peculiar intimacy. Without the expectation of permanence, she and Mirza Hassan speak more freely than she ever did with her first husband. They discuss his travels, her memories of life before widowhood, the political changes sweeping through the empire. There's a strange freedom in knowing that neither must please the other beyond the terms of their contract. The neighbors' reactions range from acceptance to quiet disapproval. The older women remember when mut'ah was more common, when it served as a bridge between maidenhood and permanent. Marriage for women whose circumstances were complicated. The younger women, influenced by the growing conservatism of some clerics, whisper about the difference between temporary marriage and prostitution, though they're careful not to say such things too loudly. Zara's sister-in-law visits weekly, ostensibly to check on the house, but really to observe this strange arrangement. She brings news from the extended family and subtle pressure about Zara's future. This cannot continue indefinitely, she says over tea and honey cakes. What will happen when the merchant stops coming to Isfahan? What will happen when you're too old for such arrangements? These are fair questions, but Zara has no answers. She lives in the present tense of her temporary marriage, managing the household that isn't quite hers, caring for the man who isn't quite her husband, existing in a space between conventional social categories. Mirza Hassan, for his part, seems equally uncertain about the broader implications of their arrangement. He speaks sometimes of his permanent wife in Kashan, a woman he married in his youth who has borne him 3 sons. She knows of his mut'ah marriages. The contracts require disclosure and apparently accepts them as part of the business of being married to a traveling merchant. But he rarely mentions her, and Zara wonders if the temporary nature of their union makes it easier for him to be fully present in Isfahan, or if it creates a distance that permanent marriage wouldn't have. The strangest aspect of mut'ah, Zara reflects, is how it forces honesty about the practical nature of marriage, while simultaneously creating space for something like affection to develop. She and Mirza Hassan have grown fond of each other in ways that their original contract couldn't have anticipated. They've developed small rituals, morning tea, taken together in the courtyard, evening walks through the neighborhood, conversations that stretch long into the night about everything and nothing. As the weeks pass, Zara finds herself dreading the approaching end of their contract. Not because she has fallen in love with Mirza Hassan. Their affection is too measured, too practical for that, but because she has grown comfortable with this version of herself. The temporary wife is more confident than the permanent widow, more independent than the conventional woman she was raised to be. The business of the bazaar continues around them, indifferent to their small domestic drama. Merchants haggle over prices. Pilgrims arrive from distant cities. Students debate theology in the madrasas. Isfahan remains what it has always been, a city of temporary residence, of people passing through on their way to somewhere else. In this context, their temporary marriage seems less strange, more like a natural adaptation to the rhythms of urban life. One evening, as they sit in the courtyard watching the stars emerge over the city's distinctive blue domes, Mirza Hassan mentions the possibility of extending their contract. Another 3 months, he says carefully, as if testing the waters. Perhaps through the winter. Zara considers this. The extension would mean more security, more time to plan for whatever comes next. But it would also mean more whispers from the neighbors, more pressure from her in-laws, more questions about whether she's becoming too comfortable with arrangements that can't last forever. I'll think about it, she says, and realizes that this itself is a kind of freedom, the ability to choose, to negotiate, to consider her options without the weight of permanent commitment pressing down on her shoulders. The fountain continues its quiet bubbling. The city settles into its evening rhythms, and Zara contemplates the strange gift of temporary marriage, the opportunity to be a wife without surrendering her autonomy, to experience intimacy without the burden of forever, to exist in the space between convention and possibility. In the morning, she will wake as a temporary wife in a temporary arrangement, and somehow, in this age of rigid social structures and limited choices for women, that feels like a small revolution. Verse 3, the testing ground of Tenochtitlan. The morning sun catches the surface of Lake Texcoco as Itzel walks through the floating gardens toward the ceremonial platform, where her trial marriage will be evaluated. For 1 full year, she and Nikali have lived as husband and wife in the great city of Tenochtitlan, their union blessed by the priests, but not yet confirmed by the community. Today, the elders will decide whether their partnership has proven strong enough to merit permanent recognition, or whether they should part ways and seek other matches. In the sophisticated social system of the Aztec Empire, marriage was far too important to be left to chance or passion alone. The institution of Neman trial marriage served as a careful testing ground where young couples could demonstrate their compatibility before the community invested in their permanent union. It was a practice that recognized marriage as both a personal relationship and a social contract, one that required proof of success before it could be made binding. Etzel adjusts the intricate embroidery on her hoopil, the formal blouse that marks her as a woman of the artisan class. Her fingers, skilled in the delicate work of feather art, trace the patterns that tell the story of her family's specialization in creating ceremonial objects for the temple. Beside her, Nikali walks with the measured pace of a man trained in the warrior schools, his bearing straight despite the uncertainty of the day ahead. Their trial marriage began at the festival of Toxcadle, when the priest selected promising matches from among the eligible young people of the city. The selection process itself was elaborate. Priests consulted the sacred calendar, examined the birth dates of potential partners, and considered the social standing and skills of each family. Itzel and Nikali were matched not for love, but for the complementary nature of their abilities and the favorable alignment of their birth signs. The early months of their trial marriage had been awkward, like learning to weave with unfamiliar threads. They shared quarters in the complex housing system of Tenochtitlan, where extended families lived in connected buildings around central courtyards. Their relationship was observed by aunts and uncles, by younger siblings learning the ways of adulthood, by elders who had lived through their own trials and understood the delicate process of two people becoming one functional unit. Itzel's specialty in featherwork required patience, precision, and an artistic eye that could envision how hundreds of tiny pieces would combine to create something beautiful. Nikali's training as a warrior demanded physical strength, strategic thinking, and the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. On the surface, their skills seemed incompatible, but the priests had seen something in their combination that suggested potential. The first real test came during the harvest season, when both were required to contribute to the communal work that sustained the city. Etzel organized the women of her clan in the preparation of ceremonial decorations for the harvest festival, while Nikali led a group of young men in the construction of temporary platforms for the celebrations. Their ability to work within the larger community while maintaining their individual households was closely observed by the elders. A marriage must serve the people as well as the couple, the head priestess had explained during their initial blessing. Two people who cannot contribute to the harmony of the whole are not ready for permanent union. As the months passed, Itzel and Nikali developed their own rhythms. She would rise before dawn to work on her feather art, while the light was soft and her hands were steady. He would return from his training sessions in the late afternoon, often bringing news from the warrior schools or information about the political situation in the empire. Their conversations began as polite exchanges of daily events, but gradually deepened into discussions of their hopes, their fears, and their understanding of their roles in the complex society of the Aztec world. The physical aspect of their trial marriage was handled with the same systematic approach that governed all aspects of Aztec society. They were expected to share sleeping quarters and to behave as married couples, but they were also counseled by experienced women and men about the responsibilities and expectations of intimate partnership. Pregnancy during a trial marriage was not discouraged, but it was understood that children would complicate the final evaluation. Itzel had not conceived during their year together, a fact that brought both relief and concern. Relief, because it meant their evaluation would be simpler, based purely on their compatibility and contribution to the community. Concern, because fertility was highly valued in Aztec society, and the inability to produce children during a full year of marriage might be seen as an unfavorable sign. The evaluation process itself was thorough and public. Over the course of several days, the elders would interview neighbors, family members, and community leaders about the couple's behavior during their trial period. They would examine the quality of work each partner had produced, their participation in religious observances, their treatment of children and elderly relatives, and their general conduct as members of the community. Itzel knew that her feather work had been exceptional during the trial year. The ceremonial fan she had created for the Temple of Quetzalcoatl was considered one of the finest examples of the art form produced in recent years. Her organization of the women during the harvest festival had been praised by the elder women of her clan, but she also knew that her reserved nature, her tendency to become absorbed in her work to the exclusion of social obligations, had been noted by some as a potential weakness. Mekali's evaluation would focus on his development as a warrior and his leadership potential. He had excelled in the mock battles that were part of the training program, and his strategic thinking had earned him recognition from the war chiefs. But his gentle treatment of Itzel, his willingness to help with household tasks that were typically considered women's work, had raised questions among some of the more traditional elders about his commitment to proper gender roles. The couple had discussed these concerns during their long evening talks, weighing the advantages of permanent marriage against the possibility of dissolution. If their trial marriage was deemed unsuccessful, they would part without shame or scandal. Both would be free to enter into new trial marriages with different partners, and the community would support their efforts to find more suitable matches. But if their marriage was confirmed, they would become permanent partners in one of the most binding social contracts known to Aztec society. Divorce was possible but difficult, requiring the intervention of high-ranking priests and the payment of significant penalties. Their children would be born into a stable family structure, but they would also be locked into a relationship that might not continue to serve their individual needs as they grew and changed. As they approach the ceremonial platform where the elders wait, Itzel catches Mekali's eye and sees her own mixture of anxiety and hope reflected there. They have grown fond of each other during their year together, developed a partnership that feels both comfortable and promising. Whether that partnership will be judged sufficient by the community remains to be seen. The morning light reflects off the lake in patterns that remind Itzel of the intricate work of feather art, hundreds of individual elements combining to create something larger and more beautiful than any single component. She thinks of her marriage in similar terms. Two people, each with their own skills and perspectives, learning to work together to create something that serves both their personal needs and the needs of their community. The drums begin to sound, calling the community to witness the evaluation. Itzel and Mekali take their places before the elders, surrounded by the family members and neighbors who have observed their trial marriage from its beginning. The process that will determine their future is about to begin, and both understand that whatever the outcome, they have participated in something larger than themselves, a social system that recognizes the complexity of human relationships and the importance of testing compatibility before making permanent commitments. The city of Tenochtitlan spreads around them, its pyramids and plazas testament to the sophisticated civilization that has created this careful balance between individual choice and community needs. In this context, their trial marriage seems less like a personal drama and more like a small but important part of the larger social fabric that holds their world together. Verse 4, the monk's quiet judgment in colonial Peru. Brother Francisco's quill scratches across the parchment as he records another entry in his careful chronicle of indigenous customs, the sound echoing softly in the stone chamber that serves as his study. Outside the monastery walls, the Andean city of Cusco bustles with the complex rhythms of colonial life, where Spanish law and Christian doctrine exist in uneasy tension with practices that stretch back through centuries of indigenous tradition. The subject of today's entry troubles him, the persistent practice of sirvinakuy among the Quechua people, a form of trial marriage that continues despite decades of missionary efforts to eradicate it. As he dips his quill in the inkwell, Brother Francisco reflects on the theological implications of unions that are intentionally temporary. Relationships that seem to mock the sacred permanence of Christian marriage. Sirvinakuy literally, to serve each other, was old when the Incas ruled these mountains, and it has proven remarkably resistant to the civilizing influences of Spanish colonization. Young couples lived together for months or years, sharing households and bearing children, before deciding whether to formalize their union in a church ceremony. To Brother Francisco's mind, it represents everything that is wrong with the indigenous approach to sacred matters. Practical, where it should be spiritual; temporary, where it should be eternal; focused on earthly compatibility rather than divine will. Yet as he writes, Brother Francisco finds himself drawn into the human complexities of these arrangements, despite his theological objections. This morning, he observed a sirvinakuy ceremony in the village below the monastery, where a young woman named Chuya and her partner Amaru began their trial period with rituals that seemed to blend Christian elements with older, more troubling traditions. The ceremony took place in the early morning light, with the snow-capped peaks of the Andes serving as silent witnesses. Chuya, barely 16, wore the traditional dress of her people, layers of brightly colored wool that spoke of her family's skill in textile work. Amaru, perhaps 2 years older, carried the tools of his trade as a metalworker, evidence of the practical considerations that governed these unions. Brother Francisco had watched from a distance as the village, elder a man whose authority seemed to exist in parallel to the Spanish. Colonial structure spoke words in Quechua that the monk couldn't fully understand. The couple exchanged small gifts. She gave him a woven belt. He gave her a silver bracelet. Their families shared food and chicha, the fermented corn beer that Brother Francisco had learned to pretend he didn't notice during his pastoral visits. What struck the monk most forcefully was the absence of any sense of sin or shame in the proceedings. These people seemed to view sirvinakuy as a natural part of the process of forming families, as normal as the planting of crops or the herding of llamas. They spoke of it in the same matter-of-fact way that Spanish families might discuss the arrangement of a proper marriage, as a practical matter that required careful consideration, but not moral anguish. In his cell that evening, Brother Francisco had struggled with his conflicting responses to what he had witnessed. His training told him that any sexual relationship outside the bonds of Christian marriage was sinful, that these trial unions were little better than concubinage. But his experience as a pastor in this remote outpost had taught him that the indigenous people were not moral savages. They had their own complex systems of ethics and social organization that, while different from Christian teachings, seemed to produce stable communities and loving families. The practical results of sirvinakuy were hard to dismiss. The couples who eventually married after their trial periods seemed to have lower rates of abandonment and abuse than those who married immediately under Spanish law. The children born during these trial periods were not stigmatized or abandoned. They were welcomed into extended family networks that provided support and education. The communities themselves seemed to benefit from the careful matching process that sirvinakuy represented. Brother Francisco's correspondence with his superiors in Lima reflected his growing uncertainty about how to address these practices. The official position of the Church was clear. All such unions must be eliminated and replaced with proper Christian marriages. But the practical reality of ministry in the Andes was more complex. Direct confrontation with indigenous marriage customs often resulted in communities withdrawing from Christian instruction altogether. The families would simply move their ceremonies to more remote locations beyond the reach of Spanish oversight. The monk had learned to make careful distinctions in his reports. He would note the persistence of irregular unions and recommend continued pastoral attention. But he would also emphasize the evidence of Christian influence in these ceremonies, the occasional invocation of saints, the presence of crosses alongside traditional symbols, the gradual adoption of some European customs. In private moments, Brother Francisco found himself wondering whether the indigenous approach to marriage might actually reflect a deeper wisdom about human nature. The Spanish marriages he had witnessed often seemed to be based more on economic considerations and on genuine compatibility. Young women were married to older men for their wealth. Families were joined for political advantage, and the actual happiness of the couples involved was rarely considered. The sirvinakuy system, by contrast, seemed to prioritize the actual functioning of the relationship. Could the couple work together? Could they manage a household? Could they raise children? Did they treat each other with kindness and respect? These were the questions that mattered to the indigenous families, and Brother Francisco had to admit that they were not unreasonable considerations. His theological training provided clear answers to these questions. Marriage was a sacrament, ordained by God, not a practical arrangement to be tested and evaluated. But his pastoral experience had shown him that even sacramental marriages could be sources of great suffering when the partners were incompatible, or when the social pressures that created the union were stronger than the bonds between husband and wife. As he writes by candlelight, Brother Francisco reflects on a conversation he had with Chuy's grandmother, an elderly woman whose Spanish was limited but whose dignity was unmistakable. She had explained that sirvinakuy protected young women from bad marriages, that it allowed families to see whether potential partners were capable of the hard work that mountain life required. "The mountains do not forgive weakness," she had said in her careful Spanish. A woman needs to know that her husband will not abandon her when the storms come. Brother Francisco had tried to explain that Christian marriage provided protection through divine grace, that the sacrament created bonds that human weakness could not break. But the old woman had listened politely and then pointed to the village below, where several Spanish wives lived in effective abandonment while their husbands pursued business interests in distant cities. "Your marriages," she had said gently, "they also break. But your God will not let you try again." The observation had stung because it contained an uncomfortable truth. The Christian insistence on permanent marriage sometimes trapped people in relationships that had become destructive, while the indigenous system of sirvinakuy allowed for adjustments and changes that served the welfare of families and communities. Brother Francisco sets down his quill and stares out the small window of his cell toward the village lights flickering in the darkness below. Somewhere in those scattered households, young couples are living through their trial marriages, testing their compatibility, deciding whether to commit to permanent union or to part ways and seek other partners. The monk knows that his duty is clear. He must continue to preach against these practices, to encourage proper Christian marriage, to work toward the elimination of customs that conflict with church teaching. But he also knows that the people of these mountains have survived for centuries in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and that their social customs have evolved to serve their survival. In the morning, he will continue his work, visiting families, conducting masses, teaching Christian doctrine to children who speak Quechua as their first language. He will encounter more examples of sirvinakuy, more families who practice trial marriage alongside Christian observance, more evidence of the complex negotiation between indigenous tradition and colonial authority. But tonight, in the quiet of his cell, Brother Francisco allows himself to wonder whether the indigenous people might have something to teach the church about the nature of human relationships. Perhaps the recognition that marriage is hard work, that compatibility matters, that some unions are simply not meant to last. Perhaps these insights are not incompatible with Christian teaching, but represent a different kind of wisdom about the complexities of human love. The candle burns lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cell. Brother Francisco closes his chronicle and prepares for evening prayers, carrying with him the weight of questions that have no easy answers, the burden of serving as a bridge between worldviews that seem fundamentally incompatible, yet somehow coexist in the daily life of colonial Peru. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new examples of the persistent strength of indigenous custom, new opportunities to witness the quiet dignity of people who have found ways to balance tradition with survival, love with practicality, the sacred with the human need for happiness. Conclusion. As the fire burns low in whatever hearth you find yourself beside tonight, consider the strange continuity of these stories across time and culture. From the Scottish Highlands to the Persian bazaars, from the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan to the mountain villages of the Andes, human beings have struggled with the same fundamental questions about love and commitment, about the difference between what we want and what we need, about whether promises should be eternal or whether wisdom sometimes lies in acknowledging that circumstances change. These trial marriages, temporary unions, and experimental partnerships remind us that our ancestors were not necessarily more romantic or more practical than we are. They were simply responding to different pressures, different opportunities, different understandings of what marriage should accomplish. The hand-fasted wife in medieval Scotland, the merchant's temporary partner in Isfahan, the evaluated couple in Tenochtitlan, the indigenous families observed by Brother Francisco, all were navigating the complex territory between individual desire and social necessity. Perhaps what strikes us most about these historical arrangements is how they acknowledge uncertainty as a fundamental part of human relationships. They created space for doubt, for growth, for the possibility that two people might discover they were not suited for each other, despite their best intentions. In a world where divorce was difficult or impossible, these temporary arrangements offered a different kind of wisdom, the recognition that it might be better to test compatibility before making permanent commitments. The world has changed, of course. We live in an age of easy divorce, of serial monogamy, of relationships that can be ended with a text message or a changed social media status. But the fundamental questions remain the same. How do we know when we've found the right person? How do we balance individual happiness with social stability? How do we honor both the human need for love and the practical requirements of building a life together? These stories from the past don't offer easy answers, but they do suggest that there have always been alternatives to the romantic narratives we've been taught, different ways of thinking about commitment and compatibility. They remind us that marriage has been many things throughout history: a political alliance, an economic partnership, a religious sacrament, a social contract, a trial period, a temporary arrangement, a permanent bond. Perhaps the most comforting thing about these historical practices is how they demonstrate the resilience of human affection, even within the most practical arrangements. Margaret and Duncan, growing fond of each other despite their careful reserve. Zara and Mirza Hassan, finding unexpected intimacy in their temporary partnership. Itzel and Nikali, developing genuine cooperation through their year of testing. Even in the most systematic approaches to marriage, love had a way of emerging, not as the foundation of the relationship, but as one of its possible outcomes. As you settle into sleep tonight, let these stories remind you that the human heart has always been complicated. That love has always been both more and less than we expect it to be, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom lies not in finding the perfect formula for human relationships, but in approaching them with honesty, kindness, and the recognition that we are all, in our own ways, conducting experiments in the ancient art of living together. The past, as always, is both stranger and more familiar than we might have imagined. Rest well, knowing that the questions that keep us awake at night have kept human beings awake for centuries, and that somehow, despite all the uncertainty and complexity, we have found ways to love each other across the ages. Sleep comes easier, perhaps, when we remember that we are not the first to wonder about these things, and we will not be the last. The fire burns low, the night settles around us, and tomorrow will bring its own opportunities to practice the ongoing experiment of human connection. Good night.